This podcast contains graphic descriptions that some listeners may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. All right, now, with that being said, welcome to the Mortal Musings Podcast.
Right, so before we get into the episode today, we just wanted to mention that this week is actually a little bit different.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. So we actually were lucky enough to have Carol Ford and Linda Groundwater join us for this episode. Now, Carol and Linda are the official biographers for the actor Bob Crane. Now, what we did this episode is me and Neil decided to take a back seat, and Carol and Linda will discuss the life and the unsolved murder of Bob Crane.
Yeah, we basically just gave him floor, didn't we?
We did, yeah. We said, here's the mic, fucking take it. Now, seeing as me and Neil were taking a back seat and giving the floor to someone else, we're also releasing a mini today. So you're still going to hear me and Neil, acting the bollocks, if that's what you're into.
You might act the bollocks, I don't.
Well, Neil, today, we've got a bit of a special episode for you.
Okay.
We have the official biographers for Bob Crane, Carol Ford, and Linda Groundwater. Now, this is going to be a good one, okay? They're the authors of Bob Crane, the definitive biography. So, Linda, Carol, we are very excited to have you here, and thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much
for having us.
Yes.
I just hope we can handle this one.
It's a very interesting
We are a lot
story.
to handle.
It's very
well, thank
We're
you.
all over the globe for this one,
Yeah.
so it's fun.
So,
Well, thank you both. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, where would you like to start? Would you like to start at the beginning, get into his childhood a bit, or where do you feel is the most relevant place to start?
Well, I think because your audience is looking for the true crime, what I'm going to start with is saying that, yes, Bob Crane was, he was 49 years old when he was murdered. He was murdered in Scottsdale, Arizona in the U.S. He had been performing in a play that he directed and starred in at the time. He was very young. He was the star of Hogan's Heroes. And at that time, he had other things in the works. Now, when you do an internet search for Bob Crane, you usually come up with three big things. You come up with the fact that he was the star of Hogan's Heroes. He was Colonel Robert Hogan. Mm. He was a murder victim, and he is a tabloid scandal headline. But he was way more, much, much more than those three things. And he sometimes gets pigeonholed into those three things because that is what you might call the low-hanging fruit. That's what draws people. He was celebrity. He had the scandal, and that all blew up at the time of his death. And there's very little understanding that goes with that. And then, of course, you have a murder, and it is still unsolved to this day. And so it kind of checks all the boxes. You have somebody who was very popular, very likable, and he, is found bludgeoned to death in his sleep. The following morning, he is found. And it remains a mystery to this day. When they start investigating the crime, that is when they discover that he had been involved in a sexual lifestyle that consisted of consensual sex with adult women who, when he asked them, participated in amateur pornography with him. It was all consensual. They were aware, the women were aware of the fact that they were being recorded. It was nothing like, there was no drugs involved, certainly absolutely no kids. It was consensual adult women who, when asked and they agreed, performed in these amateur pornography videos and photographs. But this all then blows up. And so what you have is unsolved murder, sex, and you have a star of a television show who, up until his murder, was very, very, very likable he was very popular. Fans adored him. He was very popular in Hollywood. And suddenly, because of this new, what some call the dark side, he now becomes a target of ridicule. He becomes a target of judgment, and there really isn't a whole lot of understanding that goes with it. It just, is boom. He was Hogan. He was murdered. It's unsolved, and he was a creep. And so, what Linda and our third co-author and co-biographer Dee Young and I have done over decades is uncovered his true story, and so. I'd like, we're going to delve into his true story, but also for your listeners too, so that they also get the true crime aspect. We will go into the true crime as well.
Well, our listeners, that even though we're a true crime podcast, that they know by now, but we don't just focus on the crime.
Yeah, we love to hear the backstory and the biography of this person. So we think this is going to be a brilliant episode, having you guys tell us the story.
Yeah.
Super.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
I think the thing is that people have a tendency, if they see, well, really any murder, they look for a reason. And if they find anything that isn't lily white, they tend to blame the victim somehow.
Yes.
The number of comments that we have seen and responded to with, he asked for it, he should have known, what did he expect? Nobody expects to be murdered. Nobody, with rare, and I do mean rare, exception, no one deserves to be killed. Because the type of addiction that Bob had was a sex addiction, there is also that ridiculous 12-year-old attitude. I call it the prepubescent attitude of sex.
Yeah.
Oh, sex. I wish my wife had that kind of addiction.
Yeah.
It's like, no, you don't. An addiction is an addiction, and it ceases to be pleasurable when it's an addiction. And that, of course, makes an addiction grow the same way that drug addicts will, start with a particular drug and they might have a hit and then they need a little bit more. And then to get that same biochemical response, they need more and more and more and more to achieve that same end. People don't think about sex that way, but it is the same principle, where it becomes a not enjoyable. You can say you enjoy sex. Well, that's great. Most of us do. But if you're doing what Bob was doing, you're ceasing to enjoy, and you're for the sake of enjoyment, and you're trying to meet a need. And because it's sex, there is much less empathy or sympathy, because people don't understand sex. And they don't want it because they've been conditioned not to understand or talk about or whatnot when it comes to sex. And so to this day, where we will treat alcoholics with sympathy and have become much better, although not tremendous, about people with drug addictions. When you talk about a sex addiction, people just go, nah. That's not an addiction.
It's the
and
same.
it is. It's an addiction like any other.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you hear about pornography. People, you'll hear about people will be watching just normal pornography, and then that's not enough, so they move on to something else and something else and something else until it gets to extreme stuff. So yeah,
or even if you look at the true crime side of it, if you have a woman who's married with kids, suddenly people view it as a bigger issue than a sex worker, and it's like, a person's a person, regardless.
There's a lot of morality judgment that is centered on Bob, because Bob was married, throughout all of this addiction. He was married in 1949 to his childhood sweetheart, Ann Terzian, in Stamford, Connecticut. And they were married just about 20 years. They had 3 children together. And yet this was something that started very early on, back in Connecticut, back in the early 50s. It wasn't that he went out to Hollywood and couldn't handle fame and, went off the rails and just started sleeping with every woman that crossed his path. That's not what happened. This was something that started relatively early, shortly after they were married, and it grew. It took off. And when he gets out to Hollywood in 1956, he and his first wife, Anne, and at that time they had 1 son together. It was kind of like a fresh start for them. His 2 daughters weren't born until much later. They were born in 1959 and 1960. So there's a huge age difference between his first son, Bobby, Robert. He goes by Robert Jr. or Bobby, although he's not a junior. The middle names are different. You have Robert David. Bob was Robert Edward. Then when he's married to his second wife, there is Robert Scott. But he and his first wife, Anne, come out to Hollywood with Bobby. And later on, they have their 2 daughters, Debbie and Karen. I think, it ebbed and flowed a little bit as they tried to, rekindle some ththings, but it picks back up. And it's something that was with him for a good chunk of his adult life. Now it's really important to say, and we'll get into this later, that Bob, was very OCD, and he was chronicling everything in his life. So when people think, oh, he was doing all this pornography and he was taping all these women and doing all these things, that was just a small part of what he was actually doing. And when you think of the volume of chronicling that he was actually doing, Linda and I had access to all of these things in Scott's, storage unit. And, we went through all of his notes, all of his notebooks, all of his scrapbooks and the date books and the whole thing. And he has, audio recordings and, notes and diaries and all of these things, photographs of just all things. And so it's, you're going on saying, okay, he's recording dinner conversations and trips to the dentist. And if he goes on the road, he's recording, what's happening at the, when he goes and he plays and sits in for, as a drummer for, one of the big bands that he's sitting in for. He's recording all of it. And so the pornography, the amateur pornography, turns into a much smaller piece than what people actually think it was. It was a small slice of a much larger pie. And that becomes very important because it's not then him just going bananas with, I must videotape every woman. It's I must videotape all of it. All of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you said earlier, it's he was a complex person. People usually are, but I don't think a lot of people like to realize that I've put this person into that category and they shall stay in that forever.
Yeah.
Yep, that's exactly it. And there's a puritanism that comes with the discussion of sex. And we have been trained I'm a New England girl. Carol, you grew up in New England and moved to New Jersey. I'm well far away from there now, but
very conservative, very
conservative.
Very
nobody, and you would not, you would. I grew up I was a Portuguese Catholic girl living south of Boston. No, you don't talk about sex. You don't. There's no, and sex is bad. It's not bad, but you certainly don't talk about it. And if somebody hands you a book and says, "Here, read that and learn," that's how you learn about the birds and the bees. Nobody's comfortable talking about it or whatever. So that makes anyone who has any involvement in it that isn't strictly for procreational purposes with your married partner turns that into something scandalous immediately, just from the way people have been brought up to think, or brought up to, you don't talk about sex. You certainly don't record sex. You would never be involved in sex. And so even without meaning to, people have these unconscious biases and prejudices that say, if you're involved in sex, you must be a pervert, you must be a creep, you've cheated on your wife. Well, these wives were both very aware of what was going on, and they chose to stay with him. One of them kind of helped him along upon occasion. And so it's none of our business what somebody else chooses to do with their life or what partner they choose to stay with, and for whatever reason they do those things. But it was important that for Bob, and he did in the end, to recognize that there is an addiction portion of this. There is an addiction consideration to be made here. It's not just about those things that you were brought up to think. It's about how any activity or substance can become an addictive property. And people don't like to think about that when it comes to things like sex, because they've been trained, so to speak, or indoctrinated almost since childhood that you don't talk about that.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
hush
You don't
hush.
do it, you don't enjoy it, you don't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
So that it made it very easy for Bob to become the blamed victim, because when he died is when people found out about this. And so therefore that must have been the reason, post hoc ergo propter hoc, happened after, therefore caused by. And while that may be true, he was murdered. Was it caused by his addiction? Potentially, but we will never actually know that.
Yeah. And like you're saying, he was very aware of this issue he had.
Yes, he was.
Absolutely.
So much so that, he has notes so he was killed in 1978, June of 1978. So his date book from January 1st, 1978 through the night he died, and, a little bit after, because he had been planning things, shows and meetings with agents and, so on and so forth. And, but throughout his date book are notes on marriage counseling and what to do, because at that time, he and his second wife, her name was Patricia Olson. Her stage name was Sigrid Valdis. She played Hilda on Hogan's Heroes. She was the second secretary. First secretary, Cynthia Lynn, played Helga. Patty played Hilda, if I got that. I'm thinking I said Helga the second time, or the first time. But anyway, Patty was Hilda, and Bob and Patty did get married, and they got in. Towards the end, they were struggling. They were separated. She had filed divorce papers, but by many accounts, they were trying to reconcile. And it seemed that Bob wanted to, because in his date book, he had notes about, what to do and how to, move forward with that. But when he was in Scottsdale, Arizona, he was, as I had said, he was performing Beginner's Luck at the Windmill Dinner Theater. And at the Windmill Dinner Theater was a man who, at the time, Bob only knew as the man who signed the checks or who unlocked the theater, let everybody in, arranged for everybody's housing with the theater group. But he turned out that he was actually a minister, and he had been placed there by the United Church of Christ, unbeknownst to any of the actors and not just Bob, but, any of the actors the celebrities that came into the Windmill Theater dinner chain, because they had theaters in Texas and in Colorado, in Arizona, and I think in Seattle as well. And so he was placed there to help the actors if they needed help, if they were looking to talk to somebody. And so Bob was looking to get help. He didn't know where to get this help, because you have to remember the year. It's 1978. It's not 2010. It's not 2024. It is 1978. And even people who are struggling with alcohol and certainly drugs, you only had the Betty Ford Clinic at that time. There was no real, let's help people who are struggling with addiction. And so he was recognizing that it was an addiction. He was recognizing he needed to get help. His marriages had suffered for it. His children had started asking him questions that he couldn't answer properly and still call himself a good father. He was looking to better his life. And so he asked around, who can I talk to about something personal? And he was directed to Ed Beck, who was Reverend Ed Beck, and he was a counselor, not in that specific type of addiction, but he did have addiction counseling experience. And so he talked with Bob to great lengths in the weeks leading up to Bob's murder. And he was trying to get him to a point where when he got home to Los Angeles after this play wrapped in the beginning of July, that he would start some psychiatric help with someone who was an expert in sexual addiction. This was something that he wasn't walking around and saying, hey guys, I'm a sexual addict. I'm going for counseling. Look at me, look at me. It was very private. It was very, he kept it very close. He was not going around talking about this. And when he died, this was not something that was known. And so, that only came out much, much later. Linda, and Linda, you can talk about it, but, the cassette tapes that you received in the mail from Reverend Beck going into the great detail of, these conversations that he had with Bob, where Bob was absolutely trying to, work his way into some sort of, and I use the word treatment because it's what we know today, but it wouldn't have been a quote unquote treatment back then because that's not the word that they necessarily use. But yeah, I mean, it's something that, he was really struggling with. He had gone for, like I said, most of his adult life with it. And now he's realizing this is a problem. And he had known it was a problem, for, even before this, because he had tried to get out of it on his own. And you can't. He would show up in a city and he would be like, I'm not going to mess around. I'm not going to mess around. And then the next thing you know is there goes a pretty woman and he's asking her, hey, do you want to go back to my place? And yeah, that's right. That's right. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Linda. From the neck down. But he was not, you can't fight addiction on your own. And he was coming to that conclusion about it.
I'm actually surprised that in the 70s, they saw it as an addiction and they didn't say, no, it's fine. You're a man.
Yeah.
I'm actually surprised.
It was early.
Yeah, it was very, very early in that piece. And I think Bob just kind of got lucky. I was going to say lucked out, but in Australia, that doesn't mean what it means in the States. Lucked out at home means got really lucky, and here it means you had no luck at all. So let's just say he got lucky. You lucked out. That's terrible. I'm like, no, that's good. That Bob got very lucky and that he found someone who understood that addiction is addiction.
Yeah.
And whatever you are addicted to, because the word gets thrown around, particularly with sex addiction. There are a couple of people who proclaimed that they were sex addicts in later years. David Duchovny went into rehab for a weekend to get over his sex addiction. Wow, he went 48 hours. I'm not sure that's not an addiction. Yeah. That's just give me a break and have a good sleep. And and the other was, Tiger Woods. They go, well, he was a sex addict. No, he wasn't. He was just a jerk.
Yeah.
He didn't, Bob was having sex with literally hundreds of women.
Or more.
Hundreds. Or more.
Or more.
And when, I've had people say he was just using the word addiction as an excuse to cheat on his wife. Well, you cheat on your wife with maybe one or two people. Using it as an excuse to cheat on your wife would not result in hundreds of people. That's just a problem,
Yeah.
And Bob was lucky enough to get someone like the Reverend Ed Beck, who even back then said, this is an actual issue. And what the Reverend said to us was that a sex addiction it's a biochemical addiction. It is harder than some of the hardest drugs to beat because it is already within your body.
Yeah.
And for someone like Bob, where it was women, not alcohol, not heroin or cocaine or LSD or marijuana. Bob didn't drink and he didn't smoke and he didn't do drugs. He just didn't. But you couldn't get him out of having sex. But
Yeah.
unlike those drugs where you could say, they go to a show and say, guest star somewhere and they go, make sure there's no alcohol in this room, or make sure there's no alcohol available, make sure nobody can get him access to drugs. How do you say, make sure he has no access to women? They're half the planet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to get someone who could actually recognize that this is a huge issue physiologically was a true stroke of luck. And although, as Carol said, the Reverend Ed Beck was a counselor, but not an addiction counselor, he knew how to find the right people to help Bob, and Bob was intending to do that if he'd had the chance to go home. But yeah, you're right. In those days, it's often like it is now, really. We haven't gotten so much better about it now. Like I said, you have somebody who says, they're addicted to sex and they go, yee.
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah.
And I think in some ways, and not to throw any political flame on this, but I think in some ways it's getting worse, at least over here in the States.
Yeah. I think
because they don't like any kind of addiction. And they're not going to show empathy or sympathy to any kind of addict. But I have said on many podcasts and to many people before, I don't know any addict who, as a child, says, I want to grow up and have this completely unhealthy dependence on something out of my control. Yeah. Bob didn't ask to be an addict. And how the heck would he know that by having sex, he was going to turn out to be a sex addict? How on earth would he have guessed that? You might think that if someone hands you heroin, that you go, okay, this is an addictive thing and it's going to be bad for me. But I can handle it. There's just that whole, misconception of someone's ability to handle an addictive substance. But there are millions of people in the world who have sex and they don't do what Bob did because they had something in their system that did not require them to go off and have sex with hundreds of women. Bob could never have suspected that by having sex, he was going to end up being a sex addict. How could he have possibly known that?
And you know what else? You have to remember the era in which Bob is living. So from the 1950s to the 1960s and into the 1970s, you've got, if you've ever watched Mad Men, which goes from the early 1960s through into the early 1970s. I mean, those characters, the men are very, they're having sex with tons of women. There's also the shift from the very, very tight and not going to, or at least not talk about it, to make love, not war. And so you're going into the sexual revolution. And so a lot of your actors were having a lot of sex.
And pre-AIDS.
And pre-AIDS, right. And exactly. I mean, you might get an STD, but you might not you're not going to have the AIDS issue, which could kill you. But also, you're in an era that it's the whole sexual revolution before you get to boom, as Bob is coming to terms with it on his own. You're also coming out of that sexual revolution and you're going into the much more rigid 1980s. It's swinging back around again. And so that could have also had something to do with his own thought process. But during the time in which he lived, there's a lot of sex happening. There's an awful lot of sex happening, and people don't realize that their other favorite actors, not all of them, but a lot of them, are doing kind of the same thing. But they're not. They didn't get caught. They didn't get murdered, and so they're that piece of their lives stayed hidden. But Bob's became front page news because he was murdered.
So I'm so happy to hear you say that about TV shows, because I was going to say that in the UK there used to be a TV show called Carry On. They do like Carry On Camping.
Oh
Carry
God,
On.
yes.
Like,
They're big in Australia too.
So the Carry On films, there was always like there's an actor in it, Sid James. His character in all the movies, he was chasing after women all the time.
Yep.
Like it was a normal thing. I'm trying to think if there's any more.
Well, there was like Benny Hill. I mean, Benny Hill.
Yes.
Yeah.
Benny Hill was always, running around.
Literally chasing after them.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a very good point to make, though, because it's so easy to kind of put that to the back of your mind and not realize the different time frames. And like you said, when it comes back around, when it gets to the 80s and things get a little bit more uptight again, people don't really factor that in necessarily.
We have a very bad habit, and I think this goes for all things. We tend to put, current the way things are currently, and project them backwards into time periods where the way the laws and the the policies,
morality,
and all of it. You can't sit here in 2024 and judge something from 1978 or 1960, or you go back even further. You can go as far back. You can go back to the dawn of time. You can I've seen it with in here. People are looking at George Washington. Well, he owned slaves, so let's pull down all the statues of George Washington, and this one and that one are fine. They're not as good and squeaky clean, and it, they're putting parameters around historical figures that you can't do that. It's a different time. You have to allow them to exist in their time period, with the laws and with the parameters that they had. If you start putting the stamp of 2024 on everything in the past, and that goes for Bob too, that you can't do it. But people don't think that way, and unfortunately, as they throw the 2024 saran wrap around all of this, then it becomes impossible to look at it through the lens of 1978 and beyond.
I mean, it is easy to look at Bob's situation, and even in a 1978 era, say, geez, he was cheating on his wives. I mean, that pretty much goes to almost any era. You're cheating on your wife. Anything in the 20th century, to the degree that he was doing that. But it's very easy to put that judgment on. Yes, he was cheating on his wife. Yes, he knew he was a bad husband. Yes, he knew he was not being as good a father as he wanted to be, as he could be, as he should be.
Yeah.
However, you have to put that in the context of these women knew this, and they were still with him. So how do we judge from the outside and say, that's wrong? It's objectively unusual to engage in the activity that Bob was engaging in, to the degree that he was engaging in it. Is it unusual to have sex outside your marriage? Sadly not. It's not something that everyone who listens and judges him for can say that they have never done. However, if your partner is aware of it and stays with you for 20 years, and following that 8 years, and helps you, encourages some of that behavior in some cases, then how do we step in and say, you can't do that, that's wrong? It's not our lives to judge that way. And we just need
Exactly.
to, would we do that in our marriage? I mean, no, no, but I wasn't married to Bob Crane. I'm married to Paul Groundwater, so, and neither of us would be thrilled if the other did that, but I'm not married to Bob Crane.
Yeah.
I don't know what I would do if I was married to Bob Crane.
Exactly. And even if you're to put aside the addiction thing, the whole issue of cheating, it's like, yeah, maybe it's not the nicest thing to experience from a partner, but does that make them a terrible person? No, they may have done a bad thing. It's so easy to judge when it's not your situation.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. Because so much focus is on Bob's murder and scandal and all of that, what doesn't get covered as much is, are all of the things that he did that were good. So, people know Bob Crane from Hogan's Heroes. Well, Bob, there's so much before and during and after that Bob did. Bob was very charitable. He gave to many different charities, just of his time and of his talents. He, and to take this all the way back, I mean, I think we probably should look at Bob as, we should look at Bob as a human being, but someone who came into this world and he had drive. He had, all of this, talent, and he wanted to, go forward with that. Going to Hogan's Heroes, when Bob auditioned for Hogan's Heroes, he was coming off of KNX CBS Radio, where he had worked for 9 years. And while he was doing the radio show, he was also on the Donna Reed show. And a lot of people think he either got fired from Donna Reed or that he stormed off because he wasn't making enough money. But what really happened was he got bored. He just got bored with the premise of doing the next door neighbor, husband, white picket fence sitcom. And so he said, look, I want to go do something else. And they said, fine. And there were no hard feelings. And he and Donna Reed and her producer husband, Tony Owen, remained friends. And at that point, he started getting a lot of different calls from producers saying, we want you on this sitcom, or we want you on that sitcom. And one of them was Please Don't Eat the Daisies. Another one was My Mother the Car. But it was this World War II prison camp that really sounded interesting to him. And he thought, how can this be funny? It's World War II. It's the Nazis, because, you're only talking 20 years since the end of World War II, when Hogan's Heroes premiered in 1965. So, not a whole lot of time. And so Bob had a brother that served in the Navy during World War II. His older brother, Al, was on the USS Bunker Hill, which was attacked by 2 kamikaze planes. And he was very, very badly injured. And he survived. But that had a huge effect on Bob. And, he had uncles and other family members and other friends who had served in the war. And so, World War II, just like everybody, had hit very close to home for Bob. So when he auditioned for the role of Hogan, and he was offered that role, he wanted to make sure that veterans and former POWs were not going to be offended, because it's very easy to, put this out there. You're making fun of something that is horrific. And if it's not seen in the right light, people are going to be upset by it. So he wanted to be sure. So he had a trailer, which ended up being the pilot episode, sent out to veterans groups in the Midwest of the United States. And they screened it. And he said, I want their feedback, because if this comes back, he's like, I think it's funny. I think it's hilarious. But he was very sensitive, and he said, if this comes back and they don't like it, then I'm out. But the feedback was, this is funny. This is great. If it weren't for humor, we never would have gotten through. And so he went forward with it. Now there were all these all these misconceptions about the show being in a concentration camp versus a POW camp. And of course, you cannot ever make fun of a concentration camp. Robert Clary, who played LeBeau, actually was in concentration camp with his family, lost many, many family members, and he has done documentaries. He's written his own book. He has since passed away. And he's actually was one of the longest surviving cast members of Hogan's Heroes. But he, he went on the show and he was not offended by it. He saw it as a way to get back through humor, as did many of the other Jewish people who were involved with the show. A lot of the cast, or a lot of the crew, some of the supporting cast were Jewish.
A lot of the Germans.
A lot of the Germans, yes.
A lot of the ones who played Germans on the show. John Banner, Werner Klemperer, Leon Askin, those people had family. Howard Kane, and those people had family who escaped, or Cynthia Lynn.
Yes.
His family escaped from Lithuania. And so Lithuania?
Yes.
So, these people saw the show for what it was, which was satire.
Yes.
And accepted that this was a great way to
get back,
break out of that, and to get them back. And it, as Bob had once said, this wasn't about showing the Germans to be fools. And Hogan's Heroes is actually quite popular in Germany. They're not allowed to say certain things on the air. When they say Heil Hitler, they now say, and the sunflowers grow this high. But they understood that it wasn't about making the Germans look like idiots. It wasn't saying, look how stupid the Germans are. It was saying, look how clever the Allies are. And there is a difference. There is a difference. And if the byproduct was that the good guys win and the Germans look a bit foolish, then that's the way it was. There was always danger underneath that humor. There was always the chance that, the Gestapo would come in, or someone would be killed, or, there were occasions on the show, not many, but there were occasions on the show where you would see one of the good guys would get killed. And it was never joked about. It was very serious. And that's why this show did so well, was that after it got past all those initial misconceptions, people started to understand what it was. But as Carol said, it was very important to Bob that they not be doing anything that would offend or hurt veterans or their families. And although, you'll still see people occasionally who go, oh, my grandfather hated that show, I don't see why it was funny. It's like the bulk of the people found it fantastic. And the POWs had said, look, if we couldn't laugh when we were there, we'd have never made it out. And this was a great release for them as well.
Yes, for sure.
Huge amounts of compassion, to make sure these people got it, they understood it, they liked it, they approved of it. When he was working on Hogan's Heroes, was that, would you say, his favorite point of his career, do you think? Was that like his high point?
It was definitely a high point, but I wouldn't say it was his favorite. I think if he were to have two favorites, it would be Hogan's Heroes, but it would also be radio. Bob was, his radio career does not receive the attention that it deserves. He is, it's overlooked again because of Hogan's Heroes. It's overlooked because of, the murder, the scandal. It is something that, when Linda and Dee and I started researching Bob, the only thing that you could really find on Bob's radio career was that he, did a little bit of radio work on the East Coast at WICC in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Got his start at WLEA in Hornell, New York, went out to KNX, and he was king of the LA airwaves, which, Linda and I laugh about because when we talked to the people that he worked with at KNX, they were like, we don't even know where that, thing came, king of the LA airwaves, but it's what stuck to this day for some unknown reason. They didn't even remember how it even came to be that he was called that. But it was just kind of like, yeah, he did this little bit of radio. Then he got Hogan's Heroes. Woo, woo, woo. And then he fell off and then he was murdered. And it's like, no, his radio career is the stuff of legend. And it's probably one of my favorite areas to talk about, only because I started collecting some of his air checks, really early on. I think, Linda, even before I met up with you. And when you listen to his air checks, most of them are from KNX. There are a few out there from KMPC, which is another Los Angeles radio station that he did some work at in the 1970s after Hogan's Heroes. But his delivery, Armed Forces Radio Network, was actually, he was doing that while he was doing Hogan's Heroes. He was volunteering for Armed Forces Radio Network. But listening to him do his radio shows, you mentioned sampling earlier. I mean, Bob invented it. Other radio personalities, DJs, they try and take credit for it, but it was really Bob who set the stage for it and really invented it. He takes the show and he just runs it all together. There is no stop and start. It is, he comes on the air, he introduces it, he plays a record, he plays his drums while he's playing the record, then he cuts to a commercial, he interacts with the commercial. He was known as radio's man of 1,000 voices. He does sound effects. He makes a sport out of the whole thing. Leo McElroy, one of his colleagues at KNX, called it a spectator sport, that to watch Bob at the mic in his studio, in the booth, doing his radio show, he's flying all over the place. He's just wild all over the place. Recently, we're in the process of releasing some air checks on our own podcast, Flipside, the True Story of Bob Crane. And part 1 just went up last week. Part 2 is going to go up tomorrow. There are 4 parts. It's his 8th anniversary at KNX. He had celebrity interviews that he also did. He interviewed thousands of celebrities from the 50s and 60s. Everybody: Jack Lemmon, Marilyn Monroe, Jane Mansfield, Dick Van Dyke. It's a roster of everybody who was anybody in show business at that time. And even in the one air check of that, and I can't remember who it was. I want to say it might have been George Jessel, but I don't remember. Says, you should see how he is flying around this booth. There should be cameras on you because people can't even believe what it is that you're doing in here. And he's doing all of these crazy things. And he does not get anywhere near the credit that he should get. People would be amazed to know all of the work and all of the things that he did in radio, the advances he did in radio. He unboxed radio, and maybe not all of it was perfectly great when you get down to it, but some of the things that he did in radio, like having the radio personality or the DJ play their own records, that was something that had never been done before in a union station until Bob Crane came along. Now the DJs do it. They sit there at a computer and do it. They have an engineer doing stuff, but they're selecting the songs. They're putting in the tracks. They're doing all of that. That was a big no-no back in the 50s and pre Bob Crane. That was something that at a union station like KNX, CBS Radio, you were not going to touch those records. You were going to let your engineer do that. And Bob got them to bend the rules for him. And, these are things that are tremendous in radio and in broadcasting. And his work in radio deserves so much more attention than what it gets. So when you say favorite, yes, Hogan's Heroes was clearly a favorite part of his life. Absolutely. I mean, how could it not be? But
he loved it.
But
he loved it.
He was always a radio man. He was always a radio man before Hogan's and after and during.
Yeah, I mean, it is amazing. As like you said, Dick Van Dyke, he was also on the Dick Van Dyke Show, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. That's how he was
Yes.
discovered. Yeah, he sure was.
Mhm.
It's one of the best
Tremendous.
episodes. It is. It's in the top 10. Somebody
It
has
is.
to play Cleopatra, and it's if you haven't seen it, highly recommend it. And he plays drums in that too. They are tom toms, but he still plays them, or bongos rather, but he still plays them.
Bongo.
And
Mhm.
you
You can
know,
see him, you can see the beginning of Bob's comic timing. He was learning as an actor then, and he had just come off his no acting clause in his KNX contracts, which, when people went out to Hollywood, they would lose their people to television quite often. So KNX put him on a clause that said no acting for 5 years, no paid acting for 5 years. So Bob really wanted to get into the acting thing, and that's exactly how he phrased it. I really want to get into the acting thing. And he was having a hard time, and his heroes were people like Jack Lemmon and Gig Young, and he was being passed over for people like Tony Randall, but he really wanted to. That was the kind of acting that Bob wanted to do, is what he felt suited him, and it certainly did. And when he had a chance to do the Dick Van Dyke Show in Somebody Has to Play Cleopatra, you could see the kernel, no pun intended, of the real comic talent that he had. It's about timing. It's about being able to interact with the other characters, and as an actor, not to take over the scene, but to with certainly with your co-actors, but to be able to bring that scene up to its absolute best. I do some acting myself, so I often watch the things that are done more from a shall we say, professional level versus just for entertainment value. And you could see that Bob was just beginning to really get it. He really got it. He got into a groove of something that suited him. It was funny. It was memorable. The timing was perfect. And that really was how he, like Carol said, that was how he was really discovered. And it just shot him straight through. But having said that, Bob worked at it. Timing is something that you need to hone. You need to have some innate sense. It's like music. You learn music, but you really need to have a sense of rhythm. Some people carry a tune in a bucket.
It's that music that gave him that sense of timing as well. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And so there was, but Bob studied. He studied at the Stella Adler Studios. He went to plays and took notes. Here's what I liked. Here's what I didn't like. Here's what I thought I would do better. He applied what he did with radio to his work in television and movies and theater, because Bob often did live theater well before Hogan's Heroes, that he was never afraid to learn and then take and change and do better. One key thing about Bob was he was willing to learn. Many actors, once they're successful, are not. Bob never stopped having that capacity and willingness to learn.
Which is amazing. Yes. That's absolutely amazing. If we're to jump forward to the night of the murder, what can you tell me about that? Is there a lot of information about the scene, how it happened, or is it all a bit of a mystery, really?
Well, the actual the night of the murder, Bob, that itself is not a mystery. Bob had finished his play, performing his play, Beginner's Luck. He went out into the lobby and signed autographs for a bit. Afterwards, he met up with his, they'll, in the press and in the movies and whatnot, they call him his best friend. He was not his best friend. He was a friend of sorts, John Henry Carpenter, who is different from the film producer director, John Carpenter. John Henry Carpenter was a salesman for Sony, and he was the one that got Bob a lot of the parts for the cameras and whatnot. And so they struck up a friendship. Some people say that Richard Dawson, who played Newkirk on Hogan's Heroes, introduced them back when they were on Hogan's Heroes. But some people couldn't really recall if it was Bob who had the connection first or whatever. But in any case, John Carpenter would travel to the different cities to meet up with Bob. They did not stay in the same apartment together. He would rent his own hotel room, but in the same city. And then afterwards, they would, after the performance, they would go and they would carouse. So on this particular evening, after Bob signs autographs, he meets up with John Carpenter out back at the theater where the rental car is, and they discover that there is a flat tire on the rental car, Bob's rental car. And so that is considered perhaps, although not proven, a failed first attempt on Bob's life. They get the car over to a repair shop, and then they proceed to go to a diner in Scottsdale, Bobby McGee's, where witnesses claimed that they had a very serious conversation. Although it's not known what was said, it did not look like they were having a fun and happy conversation. And it is speculated that at that point, Bob may have been telling John Carpenter that he was looking to no longer take part in the sexual escapades, and that he was kind of cutting him loose, like, I don't want to hang out with you anymore because I'm taking this change, although that is speculation. From there, they go back to the apartment where Bob had been staying. Now, where Bob was staying was different from where the rest of the cast was staying. He was at the Winfield apartment condo complex. The rest of the cast was at a different location. And that's just something that they did for the star performers. They had a separate, for privacy and whatnot, they had a separate place for the star to stay, regardless of who it was. And so John Carpenter goes back with Bob to his apartment for a bit. At that point, it is noted that Bob has a phone conversation with his wife, Patty. Bob does an awful lot of yelling. Now, we don't know if it's to Patty. We don't know who he's yelling at, but there is yelling that goes on at that time. It's later in the evening, maybe around midnight or so, 11 o'clock, somewhere in that vicinity. But he's very upset about something, and the neighbors comment on it. And they say, boy, he better stop yelling like that or he's not going to be able to perform tomorrow. So that comes to an end. Whatever happens there, that ends. It is at this point when it is speculated that John Carpenter leaves the apartment and goes back to his hotel, and Bob turns in for the night. And Bob was always one to lock the door behind him. He was very much aware of the fact that he wanted to make sure everything was locked up. He was also a very light sleeper, and he, went to bed. And at some point in the night, probably around 4 o'clock in the morning, local Phoenix time, local Scottsdale time, somebody made their way into the apartment. Now, there was no forced entry, so we don't know if the person was in the apartment at the time Bob went to sleep, or if they let themselves in, or whoever it was somebody who Bob was very comfortable going to sleep with, because the door was unlocked. And Bob went to sleep in his boxer shorts and went to sleep. He was sound asleep. At that point, the person who murdered Bob killed him with what police believe, although they never found the murder weapon, was a camera tripod. There were 2 hits to the back of his skull. The first blow knocked him out completely. It could have killed him, but after the first blow, he would never have known what happened next, even if he was still alive. The second blow certainly did kill him. He then, at that point, The next day he was going to have first he had a meeting with his co-star in Beginner's Luck, Victoria Barry Wells, and he failed to show up for that. He also failed to show up for a luncheon that he was going to be, you're a star, you're going to different, things in town, you're Colonel Hogan and whatnot. So he failed to show up for that as well. Victoria Barry Wells, this was not like Bob to not show up. He was very punctual. He made all of his appointments. So she went over to the apartment and found that the door was unlocked. She went in and it was dark and it was cold in the apartment. She went into the back bedroom calling his name, and what she saw was somebody in the bed. She did not know it was Bob at first, but she thought it was a woman because she thought she saw long, dark hair. But whoever it was, she said, oh, somebody is dead in Bob Crane's apartment. So she calls 911. This is where the investigation starts. And so the police come and they find that it is Bob Crane in bed. And what she thought was long hair was actually the blood from Bob's scalp, from his head. And from that point on, the crime scene is just a complete botched mess, isn't it, Linda?
Oh, yeah. Look, and we've had this discussion with other people in the actual, law enforcement industry before, and it always blows them away when we tell them what happened at the crime scene, which is basically that people were allowed to traipse in and out. People were allowed to smoke in there. People were allowed to use the phone. They let people come in and take things out of the condominium. They moved things around. They couldn't have. You couldn't have done more poorly than they did. There is video. I was a couple of years ago a guest on, there's that TV show Autopsy, The Last Hours of, with Dr. Michael Hunter. And they actually did an episode on Bob. And one of the videos that they show was the video of the police and the medical examiner at the crime scene. And which, they didn't do this with any of their other, I haven't seen them do this with any of their other episodes. So it was a little sad, actually, that they did this, but they actually showed Bob laying there on the bed. And the medical examiner was climbing all over him in the room. And when they needed someone to identify his body in the short term, as in before family came, and so they asked the Reverend Ed Beck to do so. And the Reverend Beck said that he was a Marine. Remember, this was 1978, and he'd been a Marine in Vietnam. Reverend Beck was not a little guy. He was a big guy. He had a lot of bulk. He had a beautiful soul, but he was a Marine. So he could take a lot of stuff. He'd been in Nam and whatnot. And when he went in, he said he nearly ran out of the room because Bob had been laying on his side, as Carol said, and there was blood all down the side of his face. And of course, his face would have been swollen and, it wouldn't have been nice to look at. But because they wanted him to identify Bob and he was lying on his side, what they did was they got him all jerry-rigged with ropes and things and then pulled his body to sit up in the bed.
Jesus.
When someone walked into the room. I mean, can you imagine? He said it was horrific and it was horrifying. He said, I nearly ran screaming out of the room. There was blood all over the room, on the walls, on the ceiling. And of course, all seeped into the bed because Bob had been there, 7-8 hours. And they just made the biggest mess of the crime scene. And then when they finally got to the point to go to trial, they lost things. They lost their evidence. They lost their items. They just did not handle it well at all.
That image is going to be ingrained in his mind forever.
Absolutely. Because we spoke to him, in 2005? I think 2004, 5 or 6. And he had done that in 1978. And he remembered it like it was yesterday. Just can't even imagine.
another thing that they did wrong, and that is they became laser focused on one suspect and one suspect only, and that was John Henry Carpenter. Now, I'm not going to sit here and sing his praises. He certainly wasn't a stellar individual. He was a hanger-on. He was somebody who, took advantage of Bob's celebrity, and, he got what, some people would call the sloppy seconds or, whatever, but he was instantly the prime suspect. And the police zeroed right in on him. They did rule out that it could have been a woman because of the forensics with the blood spatter on the walls. The arc wasn't, the blood spatter arcs weren't, conclusive for having it have been a woman. But they did just zero right in on John Carpenter. Now, John Carpenter maintained his innocence until he, right up until his death. He was arrested in the early 1990s. They found a picture of what they thought was some of Bob's brain matter on the side panel of the rental car, John Carpenter's rental car. And they did not have the actual specimen of this. They lost that, but they had the picture of it. And it's this grainy 1978 picture of something that they're calling brain matter. It's a 1978 rental car. It's not going to be the cleanest thing that you get, in that time. But they claimed that this was going to be enough to seal it, and of course it wasn't. You can't put somebody. They did bring them to trial, but a jury worth their salt is not going to convict somebody based on a grainy photograph taken in 1978 of what they think could possibly be Bob's brain matter. So he was acquitted, and he died. I think it was in 1998, and he maintained that innocence until his death. Now, fast forward to I think it was either 2016 or 2017. There was over here a Fox News reporter who decided to reopen the case. Now, the first book about Bob Crane was written by a criminologist, Robert Graysmith, who was also known for the Zodiac killers. He had done work with them and worked with the police on them or on that crime. But he had a real interest in Bob Crane, and we spoke with him. And he was very supportive of what we were doing. He had told us that a biography on Bob Crane was very, very much needed. But he did all of the legwork back in the early 1990s for his book, The Murder of Bob Crane. But along comes this Fox reporter who really wanted to look into the case himself. And so he did. And he decided to, take what he thought was a blood sample of Bob's from, again, the rental car and put it through the DNA testing. And they hyped it all up over here, and they said, "Oh yeah, we solved Bob Crane's murder," and and it turned into Al Capone's vault. They did this live reveal on television, and it was basically, nope, not Bob Crane's blood, and we don't know whose blood it is. So it was kind of a big fat nothing burger. But what he did is that he then wrote his own book, and he basically stands on the shoulders of Robert Graysmith and all of the research Robert Graysmith did, and just regurgitates it in his own book, and then puts his little spin on it as to, well, these are my theories, and this is who I think did it. And here's the little bit of blood sample that didn't go anywhere, and slaps a price book tag on it, and whatever. But what people I don't think realize is that a lot of what he did was just Robert Graysmith had already done it, and done it much better. But that is really the extent of the case to this day. I mean, there's really not any initiative or desire from the Scottsdale Police Department to reopen the case. It's pretty much it's closed in that they're not going to open it up unless there's some sort of deathbed confession at this point. The evidence locker has been released back to the estate. So whatever evidence was left is now completely tainted. I mean, it's now, it's in the estate's hands, but it's no longer secure to do anything with legally. So it's kind of sad that at this point, it probably will remain unsolved, and it will always be this great Hollywood mystery, but to the expense of, Bob's legacy, and his children have to deal with it. His family have to deal with it. His friends have had to deal with it. And Linda, Karen had told you, what was the thing that Bob's daughter Karen, told you when you saw her last year?
I came back into the U.S. last year and saw both Karen and Scott, Bob's children, two of Bob's children, and both have told us, and Karen specifically told me that the things that people say to them to their faces about their father just are extraordinary and cruel and hurtful. And, Karen was, 18 when her father was killed. And this person walked up to her, saw us, and said, you're Bob Crane's daughter. And she said, yes. I guess she didn't know him very well. Got what he deserved, didn't he? And it's like,
oh my God.
Could you imagine saying that to someone's child?
Yeah.
And can you imagine having somebody say that to you about your father? And they have had to deal with this their whole lives.
Lives. Scott was only, I think, 8 when it's 7. Scott was 7. He was born in 71. So Scott was 7, had just turned 7 when his father died. And he is still getting this, and he's dealing with his half brother claiming that his mother killed him or had him killed, or, it's just unconscionable the way people do two things. One is to blame the victim. He deserved it. He asked for it. What did he expect? And the other is to then have the audacity to go to people who knew and loved him and say things like that as if they have a right to do so. These are the same people that we will see online and try and simply educate, because there are some people who just really, they only know the headline.
Yeah.
And so Carol and I, particularly Dee doesn't care to do the
Dee's a little bit more
stuff.
behind the scenes.
She's a behind the scenes gal. She's a true radio gal. She's a behind the scenes gal that we will say, oi, this isn't the whole story. This isn't the true story. They'll say, why, they made a movie. And we go, yeah, the movie was full of baloney and deliberate deceit. But once people see something on film, they believe it's true forever. That's just the nature of the beast. And sadly, it's very hard to get around that. Made our jobs much harder because people were so scared that they were going to be misunderstood, misquoted, misrepresented again and again and again. And that's why this book exploded the way it did once people understood we weren't going to do that. But to then go online and say he got what he deserved. He was a pervert. He was a creep. Look, he cheated on his wife. It's good for you. You've never done that.
That's what I was going to ask. So still to this day, people are saying he got what he deserved.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And they're really nasty to us about it too. I mean, it's like you come on, somebody puts down, oh, he was a creep and he got what he deserved. So either Linda or I, and Linda does way better at it than I do. I tend to, take it a little bit. I'm a little more thin-skinned than Linda, but But, we'll say, we'll try and say, well, no, or, we'll try and educate in some way. We'll put up something, there's this one Hogan's Heroes fans group that is, the admins have kind of abandoned it. There's got like 40,000 people who are a part of it. And it's just a free for all. It really is something to behold. But we'll jump on and we'll say, we'll a couple sentences or whatever, and they come at us. And then they start throwing the politics in there, and it just, it's like, how do you get politics from Hogan's Heroes? You go,
we must be liberal demon rats.
Yes, yeah.
Just not judge one for an addiction. An addiction is just an excuse. No, not really.
And they throw some really horrible stuff in our direction, and we take it. We do stand up for Bob, and not just for Bob, but for all those who loved him. And we have a responsibility to, maybe not all of them, because some of them are just trolls and they're just looking for the attention, but we do stand up and say, hey, wait, there's more to his story. Yes, we do have a book. Yes, it is published by my publisher, and, he wants to get paid so he can have dinner. But our profits go to charity.
Shame on you.
Yeah. Our author profits are donated to charity. Our website, our podcast, our YouTube channel, our blog. I mean, we have so much out there that is free.
And I'm going to add in here, Carol, too. And because, and the ones that are chosen are because they were important to Bob.
Yes.
Bob did a lot for charity, and he did it quietly.
Yeah.
Another one of those things that people just don't know about or care about. Bob could not be anything except a sex addict and a murder victim. He, to them, but they don't want to know the rest.
They don't. They put up their walls, they put up their roadblocks, and they fight. They fight, and they say, "Well, we're just fangirls," and then and it's important to say, yes, we are his official biographers, but we were not commissioned. We were not sought out by Bob Crane's estate. We were not sought out by the family. We earned it. It was a hard earn. It was a really, really tough road to get from, a grassroots effort of, one building on another when they started to see what we were doing. I mean, nobody called us up and said, hey, this is the Bob Crane estate, and we would like you to write a glowing biography about Bob Crane. That's not how this went. And so people see official.
Not what we thought we were going to find out either.
It's exactly right. We didn't know what we were going to find out. We were hoping to find out good stuff. But we would get on calls with people from all over the world, and Linda's in Australia. I'm on the East Coast. We'd get, have the calls going out to the West Coast. So we had, and this is before Zoom, before all of this technology, I had spaghetti wires hanging all over my house recording the stuff, back to the good old days. But we earned it. We earned their trust. We respect their trust. We honor their trust. We are humbled by their trust because these are people that many of whom talked with us exclusively because of that trust. And to break that, we aren't going to. We aren't going to do that. And that is how we became, official, because we are the only people that Scott Crane will talk to. He will not. When somebody calls him and says, hey, autopsy, the last hours of one want to do an interview, he'll punt it over to us. That's how much the trust is. He'll say, oh, Carol, there's an Entertainment Weekly interview. Do you want it? And I'll be sure, okay. So he punts all of those interviews over to us we don't speak for the second family. That's not our role, but we are the official biographers, and we present a fair, unbiased, critical analysis of Bob Crane that happens too because of the information that we have aligned with the Bob Crane estate.
Yeah. There was something I wanted to ask you. You don't have to answer it if you don't want to.
Oh, God.
Do
we
you-
know the question.
Do you have a theory? Like, is there someone?
There are so many. Linda, take it away.
I got a list, but I think they want to know if we have a theory, and yes, we do. But we don't share it because, for one, it can cause trouble, but amongst people who are still remain, but also because none of it will ever be proven, but particularly because as his biographers, we try and stay, and people don't believe this because, as Carol said, the books turned out to be quite a positive thing, but because we try to remain objective. So we do have a theory. We have spent a lot of time with many people and on, of course, all aspects of Bob's life and death. The book focuses, of course, on life, but we certainly have an understanding of the death. And so, yes, we do have a theory. There are actually or have been 8 different theories about who killed Bob. Some of them have been discounted by forensics, but continue to be pushed by those who, for some reason, choose to. And others remain potentially a possibility. So speaking in terms of forensics, that rules out at least 2 of them. Because forensics has determined, as I think, Carol, you said before, it could not have been a woman.
Yeah.
The sheer strength that it took and the arc of the swing based on blood spatter and whatnot, because it was on the ceiling and the walls and the floor and the side table and the bed and that they have determined that this could not have been a woman. She just would not have had the upper body strength to do it unless it was a really big woman. Then it was not a woman, which rules out it being his wife, Patty, who also had an ironclad alibi, being in a completely different state, and the women and one of the women that he may have slept with. So those 2 out of the 8 are just ruled out.
Well, a theory,
there is, of course.
A theory. What's popped into my head just from listening to all this. Like I'm no Columbo, but let's say a woman he slept with was married.
I've heard
many women he slept with were married.
So it could be a husband.
So that is another theory.
Mm-hmm.
That there is that specifically the husband of Victoria Barry Wells, Alan Wells, was chosen, but also the idea that it could have been any jealous husband. Remember, and it's important to say here again, is that anything Bob did was with women was always consensual. The people that said they did not know they were being recorded were shown to be lying. And you can see very clearly on the videotapes that these women were quite aware that they were playing for the camera. And also, again, in that idea of taking things from the year 2000 plus and pushing them back into 1978, if you look at crime scene photos, and they are on the internet, no way could he have hidden a camera. Cameras were bigger than televisions, and they were great big boxes. They couldn't hide them.
Yeah.
But could it have been somebody's husband? Yes. Bob's oldest son insists that Bob's second wife, Patty, had some connection to it, and insists on saying that she may have hired someone to do that. There is zero evidence of that. and she certainly could not have done it herself. She was this tiny little nothing size of a woman. I mean, look at her on TV, you could see. There was a theory that it was potentially the mob. Bob was concerned about the mob. Scottsdale was a mob town at the time for people who were, in witness protection, and also there was some mob activity there, but that was ruled out as the actual method and personal nature of the killing. It was very personal, and they hung around that the mob certainly not. And then the other theory was that it was Bobby himself.
Going back to Linda saying it was very personal, going back to that crime scene, and I'll just mention this because it wasn't just the 2 blows from the camera tripod that they found at the crime scene. What they also found was after Bob had been killed, whoever did kill him took one of the cords from one of the cameras and tied it around his neck and tied it in a bow. And so that's post-mortem. That's very symbolic.
Which, talking about mob hits, they'd have just shot.
Yeah, a mob would have just gone in. Yeah. It would have been clean.
They would walk in and
it would not have been.
Because the murder weapon was a weapon of convenience. Mm-hmm. If it was a camera tripod, which is what they believe, it was a weapon of convenience.
Yes.
The mob would not walk in and go, gee, what can we kill this guy
right.
with? They would walk in with a plan. I worked in radio as a reporter in a town where there was mob activity, and they walked in with their guns and shot. Yeah. There was no, gee, let me see what I can find in here to kill this guy. There was, I'm walking in with this Tommy gun or this shotgun or this, pistol, and I'm going to get him. Not, gee, let me grab this and then let me hang around, because they did find a bloody handprint near the window, and they did find, other things about the place that had been disturbed, which would not, or which indicated that somebody had stayed. And you would not find any of that, of course, with the mob. They go in, they do their job, and they leave.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. And of course, the other person on the list of theories, which would also include John Carpenter, which they believe the whole rationale about that is that he was unhappy with the Bob telling him that he was no longer going to want to be in his company any longer, and he was he couldn't handle that breakup, if you will. Now Bob Crane was straight. But there is the speculation that perhaps John Carpenter was not, and that there was, maybe some, tendencies towards wanting to be something more with Bob. But Bob himself was straight, was with women only. So there is the thought that perhaps John Carpenter took it to a different level and was very upset, and that, well, if I can't have you, nobody can, kind of thing. But then that also, that becomes their laser focus, and they just did not do a good job of investigating all of the different possibilities, and they're those are just the theories that have circulated over time. I'm sure there are others that we don't even know about. Because we don't, who knows? Who knows? This case is one that law enforcement uses as what not to do when you go to the scene of the crime and start your processing of the crime scene.
I was gonna ask, in regards to the crime scene and the investigation, was there anything they did right?
They took the body out, eventually took the body out of there. That was about it.
They're also part of the crime scene was, there were bottles of alcohol, scotch, I believe it was, sitting on the table. Now they were half open. People had taken drinks out of them, had poured glasses of drinks with them. Bob did not drink. Bob did not drink. So whoever was drinking that was in that apartment. So who was in that apartment? If there are bottles of liquor sitting on the table, wouldn't you think that that might have something important there that you could maybe look at? But they let
Yeah.
those walk out the door. They were smoking in there. They were using the telephone. They kind of, set it up as like a base camp instead of a crime scene. And, it was not, it was never really secured in the way that you would think a crime scene would be or should be. We talked with a retired FBI agent a couple weeks ago, and when we were going through the crime scene and then telling him about the investigation process, you should have seen the look on his face. I mean, he's just like, he's just like, oh, good God, this is just you're telling me this stuff, and it's just, this is like, law enforcement 101, detective 101. This is not, and they, and it is a case that haunts the Scottsdale Police Department. They're not proud of it. They just, I think, wish it would go away. But it's never going to. It's never going to go away. And people are going to, constantly when they think of Bob Crane, they're always going to think of Scottsdale. That's tied to him forever. People go this is how weird it gets. Over the anniversary of his death, people have gone to the Windmill Dinner Theater, which is, I don't know if it still is, but it had been at one point been turned into a dance club. And they would have a seance there, and they would raise the ghost of Bob Crane, and it's like, oh dear, it really is, tragic on so many levels. I really wish, and I know Linda and Dee feel the same. Certainly, his family feels the same. I wish that they would solve it, because by solving it, you also put to rest the speculation and the judgment of Bob, because then that becomes a chapter closed. But until it is solved, and I don't think it ever will be, Bob is going to be the butt of jokes. He's going to be ridiculed. He's going to be judged mercilessly and held to a standard that, other people aren't. It makes me think of Paul Rubens, Pee Wee Herman, who, gets caught in a theater doing things he shouldn't be doing in a theater, and he's blackballed. He's blackballed from the community for years. And he passes away. I think he passed away last year. And he gets a free pass, man. Pee Wee, it's interesting that it's conveniently forgotten, and I don't want to drudge it all up. I mean, he dealt with it, and he did what he had to do, and got his help, and did his time, or whatever it was, paid his fines. But it's if he had died in the theater in that circumstance, it would have been an altogether different story. Yeah. But because he was allowed to live his life out to its natural end, he was able to rectify some of that. Another one that comes to mind is Macaulay Culkin, who, struggled for years with drug addiction, and he has turned himself around and has been able to, clean up his life and better his life and get the help he needed. And now people rally around him. People love a good comeback story. Bob was denied that, and people aren't. They don't want to forgive. I mean, a lot of people that when they hear us, they go, wow, we didn't know. And we get people telling us, thank you for doing this. One of my most, early on in the book, when the book first came out, I did a presentation at the Mid-Atlantic Nostalgia Convention in Baltimore, outside of Baltimore, Maryland. And this one woman, kept coming up to my table in the vendor hall, and I knew all about him, and I could never watch Hogan's Heroes again when I found out what he was really like. He was such a creep. And I said, well, maybe come to my presentation because you might be surprised at, all the good that he did. And, I don't know. And so it was 2 days of this, she'd kind of walk by my table and I'd be like, oh, are you going to come? Oh, I don't know. So the day comes and I give the presentation, and I have Linda and I have this, very detailed slide presentation of Bob from birth to death. And it covers, everything. We do tailor it down to, it is very PG rated, we'll say, because, a lot of times there will be kids and we do tend to watch for that. But we do talk about the things that he did in his life that were good, that people just don't realize or know about, and that he was trying to get help. And after the presentation, this woman came up to me and she was crying. And I thought, oh, it was my first time giving the presentation. I thought, oh, I was that bad. Oh, gosh. And she came up and I said, oh, you're crying. And she said, thank you. She said, thank you for giving me my show back. You've changed my negative perception of Bob Crane and given me my show back. And I remember after that how powerful that was, because, Bob deserves that. He deserves to have his whole story told. He deserves to have all of that. We all do, to have the whole thing told. And then if you're going to judge, then judge. But don't just judge based on Hogan, murder, scandal. Oh, I know, I saw that movie, and what do you guys know? And it's very powerful when you have people, when you see the shift in people from, creep and all the other things to, you've given me my show back. I used to love that show. I could never watch it, but now I can.
That's what I was going to ask, though. Like, apart from cheating on his wives, what bad did he do?
What bad? Well, we're all human. I mean, none of us is perfect. Yeah,
but I mean,
he didn't,
objectively bad, like nothing.
But yeah, I mean, he wanted to be good. He tried to be good. He wanted to be a good man, a brave man. There's a quote.
Bob craved acceptance.
He craved acceptance. He wanted everybody to love him because he loved everybody. He had a very difficult time, if impossible time, judging other people to see if they were good, if they were good people, because obviously one of them wasn't. But he had, one of the things that gets circulated is that Bob and Richard Dawson had this huge hatred of each other. They just hated each other. Oh God. And,
somebody said Dawson was responsible for his death. And I'm like, my goodness, they've blown things well and truly out of proportion.
People forget too that it was work. We look at it as a TV show and it's like, oh, it's Hogan's Heroes. And, oh, I love that show. And, oh, these people must all be best friends, Hogan and LeBeau and Carter and Newkirk. And, they're all best friends and it's work. They showed up for work. And I don't know about you, but, I don't love all of my coworkers all of the time. We get along, but there are days that I want to go. But if there was anything between Bob Crane and Richard Dawson, I think there could have been professional jealousy on the part of Richard Dawson, because Richard Dawson comes at it from a much more involved part as being an actor. He's born in England. He comes over here. He does vaudeville and he gets into acting relatively quickly. And so he comes up the ranks as an actor. Bob does not come up the ranks as an actor. He comes up the ranks as a radio man. And so he kind of makes the jump from radio into acting. And, a lot of them didn't take him seriously. It took a little while for the industry to take Bob seriously as an actor, and even the Emmys, when he was nominated twice for an Emmy, they overlook him because, well, he's just being himself. And he was pretty hurt by that, because he was like, no, I work hard. I work really hard at bringing that character to life. And so there was this there's this professional jealousy of Bob being, perhaps in the lead. And even though Richard Dawson does say in an interview shortly before his death that, yes, he did audition for the role of Hogan, but he knew right out of the gate that, if he had been cast as Hogan, the show would have been done in 3 episodes. He does give the credit to Bob as being the one to have brought that role to life. But Bob never had that against Richard Dawson, if there was anything. Bob had, when the show ended, he wrote letters to all of the cast and crew, thanking them for, 6 wonderful years. And that included Richard Dawson. He does allude to the fact in the letter that there was some, there were some moments during their time on Hogan's Heroes where they didn't see eye to eye, but that if there was ever anything that he needed in the industry, that don't hesitate to call on me. I will be here, to help you. We were told that by his son that he helped Richard Dawson get the role as the game show host on Family Feud. They wanted Bob to do it, and Bob did not want to do game shows. He wanted to act, and so he said, "No, I'm not interested. But go talk to Richard Dawson. Go talk to Dickie." They all called him Dickie. Go talk to Dickie, and he might take you up on that. And so that's how Richard Dawson gets Family Feud.
And there's also, the children have told us themselves that Bob had always said to them, if you need something, because he traveled a lot for work, as actors do, and didn't particularly in those days. If they were doing dinner theater and other theater like that, they would travel, and Bob traveled a lot. So what he would say to them is, if you need something and you can't get me, you go find Uncle Dickie.
Yeah.
So you don't do that with people that you don't like. I mean, there are people in my life that I would never say, hey, go find this person if you need something. Why? Because they'd be stunned and laugh in your face. If their relationship was that bad, he would never have said, go find Richard Dawson if you need something. Never in a million years. So clearly they had enough of a good relationship that they said, we can count on each other, because there were certainly other people that Bob could have counted on to help his family in need. And he chose Richard Dawson.
Bob was very sensitive. He was always very sensitive to other people's feelings. When he was in school, one of his school friends told the story about how he could imitate Bob. Bob was a voice impersonator. He could imitate anybody. And there was this one teacher who had I forget if it was a little bit of a lisp or something, and he made a little bit of fun, but then he felt really bad about it, and and didn't want to hurt the feel. He was very, very, very astutely aware of how other people felt. And, but look, Bob wasn't perfect, aside from all the sex and all of that, he was not the easiest person to work with on the Bob Crane Show, which was the NBC sitcom that was very short-lived. There were things there that, because at that point he had become famous, Bob was very good on set. People told, from every aspect, from Hogan's Heroes, and so forth. But the parts of Bob that got pretty stubborn after he made his success, and the Bob Crane Show was this mid-season replacement, he wanted to do things his way. And it wasn't always necessarily what was the right way in this particular situation, in this comedy. He wanted to do this 3-camera setup, and they weren't so sure about that. And he wanted to do this and these other things. And he really kind of, he made all of these changes. And it drove the director and the producer nuts. They were not very happy. So, could there be a stubbornness to him? Yeah, there could. But was he doing it for what he believed were the right reasons? Yeah. But was he perfect? No. But did he try to be good? Yes. And I think that's the main thing, is that, I think we all can be stubborn. I think we all can get our back up. Case in point, I think I'm, pretty good person. Linda and I both weirdly had car accidents over the last 2 weeks. I had one too. I had one on.
Yeah, thanks for sharing
yeah.
that.
I had one. I got rear-ended at an intersection, and Linda got sideswiped yesterday. So yeah, I don't know what it is. It's the February the crash club, but luckily, happily, nobody was hurt. But my point is here is that when I got rear-ended, I do have a point. When I got rear-ended, I was angry because, oh my gosh, idiot, what the heck?
Yeah.
And my initial reaction was to jump out of the car and yell because the adrenaline is going and what are you doing and whatever. And so we pull into the lot of the restaurant that was right there. And this lovely little lady gets out of her car and she's crying and she's, oh my gosh, are you hurt? And right away it diffuses me and I start crying. We call 911. We get the police report. It was a fender bender and nobody got hurt, thankfully. But my initial reaction wasn't great, and so I think that we forget that Bob was human. So he had all the ranges. One of the things that people say about Bob is, he was constantly depressed at the end. He was dark. He was brooding. He walked around. But it wasn't true. Bob was just human, and he had all the range. He had happiness. He had joy. He had sorrow. He had he got depressed. I mean, if things aren't going
He's
right.
human.
He's human, and he was not perfect, but he was perfectly human. And that's something that people tend to forget. That did he do bad things? Not intentionally, and I think that that's what distinguishes people from being good versus bad. He wanted to be good, even in the midst of all of the sex. He wanted to be good, and he was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, everyone's human. And through your telling of the story, I think the main theme which we can get from you is you tell it with so much compassion and understanding that a person is a person and, we all make mistakes. We're all flawed.
Yes.
Doesn't mean you're a bad person.
That is right.
We all have our demons,
That's right.
That's exactly right. And that's what we want people to know about Bob Crane is he was a person. He lived. The life he lived was primarily a good life. It was a full life. He was only 49 when he died. He packed a lot into his life. His life was full, and he had so much life left in it. Just about a week before he was murdered, he was interviewed by a local reporter in Scottsdale, and he mentioned that if he were to write his own autobiography, he was going to title it Laughing All the Way to the Grave. And he wanted to bring joy to people. He wanted to make people happy. He loved his fans. It doesn't mean he always, wanted to be called Colonel Hogan, but he did love his fans, and he answered all of his fan mail, and he made sure that if somebody came up to him and said, could you sign my autograph? If it was the back of a, piece of paper torn out of a, book or something, he would sign it. He would just stand there and sign it. And so, he wanted to bring happiness and joy to others, and he succeeded in that. And it's a shame, as Reverend Beck said, that so much of what we are left with is, all of this, negativity, when what the real story is somebody who, was a good man, who wanted to be a good man, was a good father, was a lacking husband and wanted to better himself in that area. And, he was looking to change. He was looking to better himself. And, I think we need to look at those pieces and, and look at him for who he was as a whole person.
I want to give a quote that one of Bob's co-stars actually said at one point, and I think it kind of goes to the heart of what we're doing. And normally we talk about the Parthenon and the specs here, Carol, but there is something else that Larry Hovis, who played Sergeant Andrew Carter, actually said, which I found particularly important. When we talk about how the world kind of mocked Bob after he died as if it was, funny and deserved and whatnot. And what he said was, for some reason, those of us who work in the entertainment and arts industry seem to be dealt with differently by people for whatever reason. Let's absolutely go beyond that. My goodness, we're people just like you, with hopes and dreams and aches and pains and fears and foolishness and despair and hardship and reward and loss, all the things that make up living that we all endure. And because Bob didn't have the chance to really work at overcoming his addiction, and everything spilled out into the public realm with no capacity to hide it or explain it or put it in context, he became that Hollywood person who Larry Hovis so eloquently said was treated differently than everybody else. If a person is killed in a car accident, God help us, if I'd been killed in a car accident yesterday instead of T-boned, nobody would be going around looking for all the things I might have done in my life to create that. But because it was Bob, they look for everything. And let's face it, the crime scene was rather an obvious place. But because of the way it was handled by everyone involved, there was no chance that he was going to be able to have any redemption. And then because of the kind of addiction that he had and the way the world still looks at that, there was no way that he was ever going to be seen as anything but the victim to blame for his own death. How ridiculous is that? If that was your family, would you want that? Never.
No,
and would you give them more leeway if they were your family? Probably, because you would understand what they came from, what they were made up of, and all the circumstances that lead to those things. And Bob didn't have that opportunity, nor did his family, who constantly now have to go, yes, I know that was my dad, but. There should be no but. This is my dad, and I'm proud that he was my dad, period. But they are, robbed of that because of how people refuse to look at a whole person, which is why Carol and I and Dee worked so hard to just go, this is the whole person. I remember doing an interview where I fully I had a whole set of questions. Now, my previous life was as a journalist. I was also in radio. I was in news. I was a reporter and an anchor. And I had, that was my forte to bring to this project. And I had a whole series of questions lined up to talk about what I thought I knew, and had to do the rest of the hour and a half completely on the wing, because what I thought I knew was not what I knew. It was completely different from what we were originally shown in print media at that time. And so Bob's family only have that stuff to deal with, because as much as we have, we tell the true story, the reason that we do so many, guest spots on podcasts and TV and radio and whatnot is because most people aren't going to take the time to sit down and read this book and learn the truth. They're going to see the headline and that's it. But if they happen to come across us when they Google and see that there's more to it, even if they only learn one thing that gives them a softer vision of who this person was and makes him more three-dimensional, then we'll have done our job.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with you. And I really do think you have. Like I said, the compassion and understanding in which you tell it. Thank you so much for coming on and not only telling Neil and I the story, but our listeners. We really, really appreciate it.
I was just about to say then, what I've noticed with our listeners is they aren't quick to judge.
They want the backstory of the person.
Yeah.
100%.
That's great. Funny thing is with this, even people who say, and I'm not saying your listeners are not, but even people who say, oh, I don't judge anyone, for some reason tend to judge this. And so the opportunity because again, it's not alcohol, it's not drugs, it's you've cheated on your wife and you've had sex. Oh my goodness, you've had sex. Well, how do you think you came to be? Somebody had sex.
Yeah.
Do not know what sex is,
Somebody had sex, and you just kind of wonder, what, and again, I do believe it goes back to that, the way we are raised is that you don't talk about sex, you don't normalize sex, you don't, when you're married, you shouldn't be having sex when you're, unless it's mutually agreed. Well, maybe they didn't mutually agree, but they certainly didn't protest. And if they did protest, they didn't protest enough that didn't make it enough to leave. When you get to Bob's second wife, you're talking about someone who would take him to a strip club and give him the gift, go in the back, take photos of your girls. Well, if she was particularly bothered by that, she wouldn't have allowed it. She knew about it when they met because she was one of the people he was cheating with. So, we don't have that right to delve into someone else's life, but there is that morality that comes with marriage and sex that isn't there when you talk about, drugs and alcohol. So any chance for people to have that one soft, not to excuse what he did. What did he do? What was an awesome thing? No. But it's not my place to say that his wife should have left him or he should have left her, or, in the end, Bob's the one who filed for divorce, not his wife, not with Anne. Bob's the one who filed for divorce with Anne. They'd been married for 20 years. Well, heck, if she was that, and there's a story about how she got very, very sick early in the early 60s, I think it was 64, 63, something like that. Bob was beside himself. He loved his wives, absolutely loved his wives. But did he have an issue? Sure did. That doesn't mean that everything about him should be, dismissed. And so it's just so important that people take that time. And I'm so grateful to you and to your listeners for taking the time to, we're not excusing his behavior. It is what it is. You can't excuse it. That's what it is. But to understand that there was a person around that behavior, and the behavior comes out of individual psychological needs and learnings. And this happened to be his. And so for us to play, morality judge, is a very hard place. And I just found an old Facebook post from 2 or 3 weeks ago where somebody just put, oh, I saw Bob in a play at this stage and he was terrific. And the first thing someone wrote was, his personal life was nothing short of despicable. Well, what's that got to do with what this person said?
Yeah.
It had zero to do with what this person said. But
it's a point we try to make.
Never allow him to pass, to get past it. They'll never allow him to get past it. So it's our job to just say, look, you don't want to get past it, don't get past it, but you don't have the right to be ignorant about it.
Absolutely. And it's a point we try to make on the podcast quite a lot. If you have, it could be a serial killer, they could have done these horrific things, and in no way are we excusing it, but so often mental illness kind of gets pushed to the side. It's like, no, let's have a look at this and understand why it's happened, It's just going to keep getting repeated.
You're not trying to say it should have happened, and you're not trying to say it's okay that it happened. You're just trying to understand how it happened or why it happened, and what circumstances create that. I mean, I'm a true crime fan. I watch ID crime and ID on channels at home, and my husband goes, how can you watch that stuff? And I go, you watch these horror films and all that rubbish. He said, yeah, but those are fake. These are But it's just trying to understand the human condition.
Yeah, exactly.
why does this happen? How does this happen? Is someone just evil? Or are they, did they have, what are the circumstances in their lives that can lead to these kinds of things? And are we all capable of that?
Yeah.
So to paint everyone with a brush does humanity, I think, a great disservice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're coming to a close now, but before we go, is there anything you'd like to promote? Would you like to talk about the book a little bit, or podcast, or anything upcoming?
Sure. So the book is Bob Crane, The Definitive Biography. It is published by AM Inc. Publishing, and it is available through, all, book retailers. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, but really it's through our publisher. Where you can get all of the information, all of the work that we do on behalf of Bob Crane, which includes the book, but also our podcasts. We have 2 of them, Flipside, the true story of Bob Crane, and Hogan's Heroes Review. We have all of our interviews are up there, or as many as we can get up there. We have just everything that's connected to our work on Bob Crane is vote4bobcrane.org. That's vote, the number 4, bobcrane.org. And that just has everything there that, from just there's a page about Bob's, it's like a bio sketch. And we have, if anybody wants to just learn more, it's a great place to start. And if you want to take the deeper dive and buy the book, we hope that you do. But really, we do try to make as much available as we can to, share his true story. And it's an important story to learn, and it's very interesting as well. So thank you so much for having us on your podcast. This has been great. We've enjoyed it. And thank you very, very much.
Oh, thank you. We've loved having you on. It's been amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Mortal Musings podcast. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and hearing extra content, subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/Mortal Musings podcast. You can also find us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Mortal Musings Podcast, or email us at mortalmusingspodcast@gmail.com.